Good evening, everyone. I'm Ellen Myers, the Programs and Communications Director for the Newton Free Library. Thanks for tuning in for The Navigation Case with author John Happ. We're grateful to our sponsors, the Norfolk County RSVP program, the Ashland Public Library, and Newton's Department of Veteran Services. I hope you'll take advantage of everything that the Newton Free Library has to offer by coming by for a visit or making use of the many digital resources we have available on our website at newtonfreelibrary.net. We have so much to offer for people of all ages. Please note that we'll take questions via the Q&A at the end of John's talk. Also, closed captioning has been enabled. You can turn it off or back on by clicking on the CC Live transcript link at the bottom of your screen. And please note that this session is being recorded. In a little while, I'll put a link in the chat for those who might want to sign up for one or more of the Newton Free Library's email lists. And it's a great way to stay in touch with everything that's happening at the library. I also want to announce that on Wednesday, February 23rd at 7 p.m., we will be partnering with the Ashland Public Library again for a very important program called Racism, Not Race, with Joseph Graves and Alan Goodman, who will be discussing their book of the same title that draws on evidence from natural and social science to dismantle the myth of gene-based racial difference. I'll put a link in the chat so that you can sign up for that program if you want. And now it is my pleasure to introduce John Happ, who is a contributing author to the Journal of the American Revolution. He has written for World War I website, the 75th Artillery CAC, and the venture magazine Atlantic Coastal Kayaker. Thank you so much, John. The screen is yours now.
Let me see here. We go. Very good. Thank you. I think I'm up, Ellen. Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Happ, and my U.S. Army Air Corps father graduated from college in the magical year of 1941. He was innocent, looking forward to starting life and a career in bookkeeping and accounting. He also graduated with a private pilot's license before the war started through one of President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs. He took flight school training at Lewis University, just outside of Chicago. I expect to amaze you this evening with a presentation about the greatest campaign in the history of the U.S. Air Force. But the battles took place in a land I barely heard of, a land which remains today one of the most primitive places on Earth, New Guinea. The scene of this story is set just after the surprise bombing of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The main characters in the story are President Franklin Roosevelt himself, General Douglas MacArthur, the 5th Air Force Commander, General George Kenney, and my father's two-man fighter aircraft, the A-20. Kenney got his start in World War I, flying for the U.S. Army Signal Corps. That was at a time when flimsy one-man biplanes were generally neglected after World War I. MacArthur spent the greater part of his youth in the Pacific, and at that time was considered the political and military authority in that area. President Roosevelt is a little bit in the background of the story. Aviation as an industry was not even a blip in GDP figures when Roosevelt was in office. But his New Deal policies pushed along the development of aviation throughout the 1930s. By 1945 rather, aviation had become the largest contributor to GDP in the largest economy on the planet, that of the United States of America. The result included a wide variety of size and weight of aircraft, And in fact, my father trained in 11 different types of aircraft, leading to this, his two-man A-20 aircraft, which he flew for the majority of the war. The first airplane weighed 750 pounds. This airplane weighed over 15,000 pounds empty, and it was used to strike at the enemy from treetop level, just over 20 feet off the ground. Just to recap a little bit about myself, on what Ellen was kind enough to mention, I speak 5 languages, and in my day job, I travel extensively, Europe and Asia. I have original research articles published in such magazines as the Journal of the American Revolution on one hand, and the Atlantic Coastal Kayaker on the other, a number of other things in between. I have business articles published in Russia, in Norway, and in Spain. And then every once in a while, I'm lucky enough to get interviewed for Japanese television for various reasons. Now the story. After sheltering 6 children and a grandmother and my parents over the span of 40 years, our family house was apprehensively cleaned out, the contents distributed among us children, and the house was put on the market. A lingering curiosity was stirred when a mysterious, crusty leather case found in our long-ignored attic came into my possession. It was stamped there as you see it, on the face of it in gold lettering, navigation, dead reckoning. And it was marked Type A with specification numbers, order numbers, and the name National Briefcase Manufacturing Company, Inc. on it. My father never spoke much about his time in World War II, and I came to realize that my father had meticulously collected his military documents, his letters, and souvenirs in this, his pilot's navigation case. From randomly within, a newspaper article tumbled out describing a massive typhoon in New Guinea, causing, quote, horror and tragedy, and resulting in the biggest loss of men and aircraft in the history of the U.S. Air Force. The fact that that episode involved my father naturally piqued my interest, but larger questions for me, larger questions remain unanswered. What was my father or any American doing in New Guinea of all places? If America was fighting Japan, why were we fighting in New Guinea? The man I knew growing up as my father was a mild-mannered, devout, church-going guy, a hobby pilot, and in fact, a gardener. It was also in the 1960s and 1970s that I grew up, the Vietnam era, when being military was not at all very popular. Kids were questioning what their parents were doing. They were questioning what America was doing and why. As a young guy, I watched haunting TV news images of battles in distant jungles. We learned as kids, my brother's ages, escaping to Canada to avoid the draft. It was gut-wrenching. I only recall that when asked about his service, my father would simply say, I was a pilot in New Guinea. Because he was so mild-mannered and even-tempered, I always thought he meant hauling goods around, flying transport aircraft, men here, equipment there. I was shocked. My brothers and sisters were shocked to learn that he was a combat pilot. In fact, he flew 64 violent and deadly combat missions in what has become known as the greatest campaign victory in the history of the U.S. Air Force. But at the end of his tour, with the World War still raging, he was rotated off the front lines to what was probably considered a benign transport role at Stout Field in Indianapolis. From there, in early 1945, he flew Battle of the Bulge, wounded, to hospitals closer to their native homes across the continental 48 United States. And while no one would argue that medical air evacuation transport missions were the same as combat missions, it was in that role that he went missing, completely lost and unaccounted for. This is the Southwest Pacific area in 1942 in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, when Japan was conquering everything in their path. This is the island of New Guinea, which lies just to the north of Australia. It is larger than France and England combined, 1,500 miles from end to end. That's the equivalent to the distance from Boston beyond the wide Mississippi River to just about Kansas City, Missouri. Once again, this is the Southwest Pacific in general. Down on the very bottom is Australia, and just above it there is New Guinea. Off to the left is Indonesia, and to the north of that is Philippines, just to orient yourself. And here again is New Guinea. Shortly after Pearl Harbor, American General Douglas MacArthur was chased from his command in the Philippines by overwhelming Japanese air and sea power. Scrambling to prepare for war, America's priority became building a supply chain linking those various and scattered islands from San Francisco to Australia, where MacArthur then made his base. On the edge of that route sat New Guinea, but Japan got there first and dominated the region from its most strategic port, located on New Britain Island, called Rabaul. It's out there on the northeast coast, and on that main island off of the northeast coast, I should say. The only Allied foothold in New Guinea was Port Moresby, just 95 miles across the Torres Straits from Australia, and that's located on this map in the lower southeast corner. As America ramped up for war across two oceans, the Allied heads of state agreed to a policy of defeating Germany first. This is very important and very unknown. No one really knew this about the war, and it's not mentioned in history books. They were going to defeat Germany first, and when that was accomplished, turn their combined force against Japan in the Pacific. In practice, Germany first meant that 85% of American war material was to be committed to fight the Nazis in Europe and to defeat them there. Directing Allied forces from his new base in Melbourne, but obviously lacking men and materials, MacArthur was obligated to fight defensive battles to protect Australia and his supply lines. Japan's war plan was to wear down the Americans and negotiate a settlement. They expected to keep a number of these various conquests that they had made as colonies. The war devolved into a faltering and tangled battle of attrition throughout the south and southeast of the island there. Those battles were fought in the dense jungles of such places as Guadalcanal, already all the way on the far right of your screen, and then at the Kokoda Trail in the southeast of New Guinea there, and then in the Coral Sea, the sea that separates in the southeast there on the far right, the sea that separates Guadalcanal from mainland New Guinea. And it was pestilence of all things. Pestilence and even malnutrition among the troops that caused more deaths on both sides of these battles, more deaths than the enemy. An Allied spring of 1942 plan to turn the tide of the Kokoda Trail battle by parachuting in troops and supplies had to be aborted due to lack of aircrafts. They only had 2 planes capable of carrying 20 men at a time. Combat was considered to be gridlocked and at a standoff. General Kenny was appointed to MacArthur's staff in August of 1942, but because of the Germany First policy, he commanded only 260 aircraft, many of them quote unquote unserviceable. They had been delivered to Australia broken down in segments, and many of the parts went missing. By the summer of 1943, some 18 months after Pearl Harbor, that's January, February, March, April, 18 months of slow hand-to-hand combat in the dense jungles, the Japanese repositioned her troops to strengthen strategic bases, and the Americans were finally able to carve out an air base at a grassy plain called Guadalcanal, 40 miles inland from the north coast there of New Guinea. During those first 18 months of the war, an estimated 24,000 Allied soldiers died, of which 17,000 were Australian troops fighting urgently to stop the Japanese advance on their homeland. All of that combat over all of those months, all of the casualties and disease and the death moved the battle lines in the Allies' favor just 200 miles from Port Moresby to Guadalcanal, from the south to north on that extreme eastern tip of New Guinea there. It was not until the fall of that same 1943, now almost 2 years after Pearl Harbor, when General Kenny's 5th Air Force was first strengthened, receiving 35 new bomb groups, a total of some 3,300 aircraft. Almost immediately, in contrast to the aborted Kokoda Trail airlift, on a day of notoriously bad flying weather in September, an operation was carried out in which 300 aircraft supported by and defended by B-25 aircraft dropped over 1,700 paratroopers into what was called the Nadzab opening of the Markham River Valley, another 20 miles northwest of Guadalcanal. Those B-25s strafed and cleared the Japanese from the area to secure the guys landing in near Guadalcanal there. And this is a picture of the B-25, a very famous B-25. But the Japanese fortress of Rabaul still loomed over General MacArthur, literally and figuratively to the north of them there. Realizing the fruitlessness of traditional ground offensive, remember those 18 months of long hand-to-hand battle, realizing that the fruitlessness of that traditional ground offensive, with his hands tied by the Germany First policy, MacArthur devised the strategy of using General Kenny's 5th Air Force to leapfrog past those enemy strongholds like Rabaul and cut them off from their sources of supply. As he was building his supply chain, he was going to cut off the Japanese from their supply chain. Now, I have real history to report. It's documented through my father's navigation case, and here's how it begins. It's called MacArthur's Triple Play, and it's brought to light for the first time through my book, The Navigation Case. Japan had been colonizing these Pacific islands in general and insinuating her forces specifically throughout the Bismarck Sea and along the northwest coast of New Guinea in preparation for an Allied counteroffensive. The key locations, if you can see them at all on the map, are considered to be Madang, Wewak, and Itep, there along the north coast of New Guinea. Then American intelligence discovered that these bases were being supplied from a massive port further north called Hollandia, thought to be out of range of Allied bombers. Hollandia is right in the middle of that north coast there. Throughout the early months of 1944, Allied pilots were tasked with slowing the enemy buildup by bombing and strafing strategic enclaves throughout this vast area. At the time, an expanding base at Wewak awed General Kenny and his men. They were, quote, unsettled by the fact that the Japanese had been receiving new men and hardware seemingly daily. It was estimated that a formidable 100,000 Japanese troops and hundreds of combat warplanes were now stationed there. Madang, a little bit to the south, served as a depot and a logistics center, partway between Guseop and Wewak. The most distant target was Itep, the third of this group of bases. It was positioned some 400 miles to the northwest of Guseop, yet still 150 miles south of Hollandia. My father's bomb group flew mainly the A-20 style of aircraft, which I mentioned. Because it was an A-20, they called their group the Roaring Twenties. They thought they were really cool. Factory specifications started that an A-20 cruised at 280 miles an hour with an estimated range of about 950 miles. I'm sorry for all these intricate details, but it goes to the heart of why MacArthur's actions are so revolutionary and so historic. Allied commanders detailed plans for the bomb group to harass the base and airstrips at Itep. These assaults were also intended to test the ship's range and evaluate the men's endurance over the 4 hours long mission out and back. On just one of those missions, my father pulled his A-20 out of a dive when he was bombing 20 feet off the ground. He pulled his nose out of the dive and his windshield exploded into his lap. He had been hit by Japanese flak. The scene was recorded by his gunner. The flight back to base took almost 2 hours over tempestuous seas and rugged mountains. As these bombing raids began to show results, the Japanese in turn cautiously moved men and equipment back to Hollandia, 550 miles away from the Americans, expecting them to be out of range of our bombers. And that presented MacArthur with a new dilemma. He was inadvertently causing the Japanese to reinforce Hollandia, a supply link further up their chain. So a diversion was created, intended to hold in place an estimated 10,000 Japanese troops in the Madang area. On March 12th, a stream of Australian troops laboriously reached to within 30 miles of Madang via jungled inland routes, simulating a traditional ground offensive. From the sea, a platoon of US troops landed on a nearby coast, representing another prong of the attack. The Japanese took the bait and interpreted these moves to be part of an Allied plan to take Madang, portending another long, drawn-out battle of attrition, which is exactly what the Japanese wanted. As that battle raged, MacArthur's theatrics continued. He ordered that more troops land at Hansa Bay, northwest of Madang, giving the impression of moving to surround that base and ultimately threaten Wewak. Strong opposition from the Japanese was expected, and intelligence reports confirmed that enemy troops were indeed being transferred down from Hollandia south to Wewak and concentrating there to confront the Allies. MacArthur's fake campaign was working. Those harassing raids on Itep, where my father almost lost his life, told General Kenny he could get more out of those A-20 airplanes and reach Hollandia. MacArthur anxiously ordered a massive knockout punch to overwhelm it. My father, pilot Len Happ of the 312th Bomb Group, wrote, "It was a very important mission because it was the final blow in the campaign known as MacArthur's Triple Play. The triple play was bypassing Wewak, Madang, and Itep to take out Hollandia, which the Japanese never expected. That line, that correspondence shows MacArthur's triple play where it is nowhere else recorded in history. And if you go back and put all the other pieces together, it can be completely verified. In that same correspondence, as a captain, he was a captain in the Army Air Corps, and then he was also an operations officer. My father described the scene further. It was known we were going to operate the A-20 in the upper limits as far as gas and mileage were concerned, and the weather forecasts were marginal. On Sunday, April 16, the men were briefed on their mission and assigned their roles. The overall attack included squadrons from multiple Allied bases, totaling an estimated 300 aircraft. Happ wrote, in fact, the whole damn 5th Air Force and 3rd Attack Group was deployed. Once again, that B-25. From the start of the mission, crews could see bad weather building. Winds jostled their wings and rattled the men in their cockpits. My father recorded, but we all took off because of the importance of the mission. Of the over 2-hour flight to their target, he added, I was leading a flight of 3 aircraft. We were to drop 500-pound bombs with a B-25, and then in his A-20s, hit the deck, that is, go down low, and strafe. The 2-man A-20 could carry a bomb load of just over 24,000 pounds. The B-25, with a crew of up to 11 men in that aircraft, carried 55,000 pounds of bombs. Again, the A-20s were to come in low and drop their bombs and strafe from 20 feet off the ground at a controlled speed of 280 miles an hour. The attack on Hollandia was a complete surprise to the Japanese. 300 of their new airplanes on various runways were destroyed before they even got off the ground. Not one Allied plane was lost to Japanese countermaneuvers or anti-aircraft fire during the raid. However, while they were engaged in their attack, a full-scale tropical storm built up, blocking their way home. Again, here's New Guinea. They're flying from left to right, from right to left over the north coast of New Guinea there, from southeast to northwest. A full-scale tropical storm had built up behind them, blocking their way home. Intense equatorial heat ignited the mountains, bringing them to a steamy boil. Thick clouds rose and spilled into the valleys. The mass overflowed, inflating itself north to south, frothing across the island. In the gurgling, turbulent clouds and low on fuel, many pilots lost their way, consumed in the grasp of weather, never to be found again. Quote, experienced pilots reported that some planes just disappeared. Others crashed into the mountains or into the sea. In the journals of mission survivors are phrases like, quote, a solid wall of weather, and, quote, the sea was whipped up into white caps by the wind. At MacArthur's headquarters, the mission was considered a great success. And just a week later, American troops landed at Hollandia, almost without opposition. Again, 18 months into the war, we could barely move troops 200 miles against the enemy. In this mission alone, troops landed at Hollandia almost without opposition. In this grand leapfrogging maneuver, MacArthur had split the enemy's defenses on New Guinea in half. Dependent on resupply from the sea, a large portion of the Japanese army in the east, caught in that Madang fake, was now isolated and helpless. In the end, the storm's toll on the Allies, the storm alone, The toll on the Allies was devastating. The loss and destruction of 37 aircraft with their gunners and pilots. It was recorded only by the men of my father's bomb group, and they recorded it as Black Sunday. And it remains today the biggest Allied operational loss, as opposed to a combat loss, in American history. We're getting close to the end now. The Japanese had conquered and evicted the Dutch from the western part of New Guinea and Indonesia, then known as the Dutch East Indies, within the first weeks of 1942 following Pearl Harbor. Oil, vital to the Japanese economy and their war machine, was found in abundance on New Guinea's Vogelkop Peninsula. Controlling this area was one of the first achievements of the Japanese in the war. The Vogelkop Peninsula is that peninsula on the far western edge of New Guinea there on your map. According to one historian, quote, commanders in Washington had looked at that region and projected oil production of as much as 16,000 barrels a day. In that July of 1944, 75 of the 312 bomb groups, my father's bomb groups, and their A-20s struck an oil field and a depot called Bouela on Sarum Island, west of the Vogelkop Peninsula. From their base in Hollandia, the target was some 2.5 hours distant, which required a refueling stopover on Biak Island in the mouth of Gelvink Bay. Again, if you can see it on your map there, Gelvink Bay is that big dip, the big bay on the western end of New Guinea there. This is an image that was found in my father's navigation case. It's at Bouela. And if you can see on the extreme left-hand side, there's a small A-20 coming out of the black smoke there after his bombing run. That's the bombing run on Bouela there. Later that month, the men flew a dangerous low-level assignment to bomb a Japanese seaplane base with transport barges and supply ships at a port town called Cocos. The installation was located in Sikar Bay on the south coast of that Vogelkop Peninsula. Cocos was a 6.5-hour round-trip mission from Hollandia, which is the time it takes for a modern one-way commercial flight to go from New York to London. An amazing sequence of photos from that mission was captured, and it shows what the pilots of my father's bomb groups and all pilots, combat pilots in New Guinea, faced as clearly as anything. Again, these images are found in my father's, navigation case, which we had never seen before. Relieved and anxious at finishing his bombing run, the airplane piloted by First Lieutenant James Nair, with Staff Sergeant Charles Reichley as his gunner, was hit by anti-aircraft flak, caught fire, and rolled to the right. Out of control. Out of control. The A-20 plunges into the bay. There it is. It's horrifying. The descriptive images give an idea of how low the squadron was flying and at what speed by how quickly Nair impacts the water and how quickly the plane crashes. It warrants emphasizing that his A-20 weighed over 15,000 pounds empty. It was over 17 feet in height and 47 feet in length. The wingspan measured just over 61 feet. But before our eyes, we see this enormous machine shatter upon impact with the sea, disintegrating. There are 4 photos in this sequence. They're all in the book. For economy, I just show you 2 of them here, but it's amazing how before our eyes, in the matter of a few clicks, you can see that plane hit, crash, and disintegrate. The sequence of photos was recorded automatically. Cameras were activated when that pilot's bombs were released as a way to later assess bombing success against their targets. But in this instance, it was Nahr and Reichley's drama that was caught in the lens. Hit, shattered. Here we are, we're coming up to the end now. In August of 1944, weeks after intense aerial bombing, American landed fresh fighting troops at a beach called Amsterdam on an island called Middelburg, again, west of the island, this peninsula called Vogelkop. In this scattered burst of aggression, specifically on August 6th, Australians reported that the Japanese were fleeing various strongholds in Gelvink Bay. They discovered the Japanese resistance on the peninsula regrouped at a port called Manokwari, and Allied forces attacked them there via undefended beaches near Sansapor. Sansapor is that little dot at the far end of the Vogelkop, on the top of the Vogelkop Peninsula there, the far end of New Guinea there. By the end of August, that port was taken, and some 25,000 Japanese troops were isolated on that peninsula. Trapped and cut off, those men amounted to the final significant enemy opposition in all of New Guinea. This was truly the first war of its kind and became the most successful demonstration of air power in the history of the United States. The Japanese threat once reached Port Moresby, again, they're in the far southeast corner of the island, across the Torres Straits from Australia. During the first 18 months of the war, an estimated 24,000 Allied troops died, moving the battle lines in the Allies' favor just 200 miles from Port Moresby to Guisop. When the 5th Air Force was strengthened, while still only receiving the raw minimum of America's military output, that represents just 15% at most of America's output. The results and the statistics became amazingly clear. The progress from Guisop to Hollandia, while costing upwards of 9,000 Allied air and ground losses, moved the battle lines over 500 miles in those first 4 months of 1944 alone. Another 4 months later from Hollandia, with the conquest of the oil-rich Vogelkop Peninsula, in August of 1944, the 5th Air Force commanded air superiority over the 1,500-mile length of New Guinea, from the Coral Sea in the southeast to the Halmahera Sea in the northwest. It was there in New Guinea that General Kenny was the first in American history to achieve the now widely accepted principle that the first goal of any military conflict is air superiority. The Battle of New Guinea is unrivaled as the greatest campaign victory in the history of the U.S. Air Force. That is the end of my presentation. This is my picture of my father. I say that it represents a man outstanding in his field, if you follow my humor. Thanks very much. That's the presentation. Ellen, back to you.
I'll just stop the screen share, John, and I do want to thank you. A very interesting and detailed presentation. Certainly, I think there's a lot for us to learn from your father's experience.
Yeah, and it all came about because of the discovery of that navigation case, which I inherited.
Yeah, you know, while people are formulating their thoughts, and I'm asking folks, please use the Q&A, not the chat, for your questions. I wonder how much of the history that's written in your book came from the navigation case versus other sources, and where did you go to look and verify some of the information that you found?
Right. So on opening the navigation case, I saw that I needed to sort the material into three piles: military orders, photos, and correspondence. And then with that, I tried to merge it with the public history of the war in the Pacific, with MacArthur's campaigns, with what General Kenny had done. And I wove all that together and tied it all together according to the general timeline of the known history of the war. And little by little, I discovered there were various pieces to all of this that were only found in my father's navigation case, but are supported by other public documents that talk about the general movements of the Allies throughout New Guinea in that phase of the war. So it was a lot of work over very, very many years. I had to rely on some veterans agents at various town halls to help me decipher some of the military jargon that was in the military orders, but it just was a fascinating experience for me to go through all that and to discover, as I said, for the very first time, that my father was in fact a combat pilot of all things.
I'm sure it was shocking. He seems like he was a very mild-mannered dad.
Yeah, I mean, it brought tears to my eyes. It brought tears to my sister's eyes when she came to, when she learned of what I discovered. So just shocking.
One of the attendees is, complimenting on what a great presentation you gave and asking, can you say more about Germany first before Japan? There was plenty of fighting going on in the Pacific earlier in the theater. Is that true?
Well, of course, the war in Europe officially started before the war in the Pacific, and the war in the Pacific was launched, with the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1942, and December 7th, 1941. And so all the fighting, all the fighting before that in the Pacific was Japan constantly invading China throughout the 1920s and 1930s. China suffered probably more than any country on the planet in the greater global conflict at that time, even though China's not spoken about that much in the context of World War II. But I'm not really clear on where the questioner wants me to take this, but there was a lot of fighting in the Pacific. And I was just invited to speak at a Memorial Day presentation this coming May. And the reason is because Europe gets so much attention, Normandy, the invasion of Normandy and all that great stuff, and the evil of the Nazis, no question about it. There's no comparison really to the evil that the Nazis perpetrated. But as we can see now, 15% of our men and equipment and personnel in general, women as well, were dedicated to the Pacific War theater, and they should not be forgotten either. So I'm been invited to give a little blurb at a Memorial Day celebration coming up in a few months, and that will highlight the fact that 15% of our personnel and equipment were committed to the Pacific, and they should not be forgotten either.
Well, on that note, one of the attendees is asking, why do you think that we aren't taught about the New Guinea War in history, the New Guinea theater in history classes?
Well, speaking from my own experience, I grew up outside of Chicago, next to a town called Skokie and near another town called Northbrook. And in those communities, there were mainly Europeans, European Jews, Greeks, Germans, Irish and Italian. And so our entire focus in that community would naturally have been in Europe. Second of all, here's the Germany First policy, which the heads of state, the Allied heads of states, agreed that all of their energy and 85% of American personnel and production should be committed to defeating Hitler and the Nazis in Europe first, and then turning our attention to the Pacific. So I rely on those two reasons mainly for why I was taught in grammar school and in high school far and away mainly about the war, World War II, as being a European war. And then a little bit on the side is, oh, and don't forget the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and we had to get them for that, which is a terrible summation of what the Pacific War was all about, but that's really what we were given.
I think you'll be fascinated to hear that one of the folks that's with us tonight, her dad, Captain J.L. Summers, who was then a lieutenant colonel, was a commanding officer at Port Moresby, New Guinea from 42 to 43. And he kept a diary of his time there. He took 1,000 photos and 6 hours of film.
Fantastic.
And, Jaylene is saying she's writing a memoir about his diary and that you filled in a lot of history of this time for her and others. So I think that's wonderful.
Ellen, can I tell you that I'm in contact with the U.S. Embassy in Port Moresby, New Guinea on maybe a monthly basis. I just received a message the other day from one of the commercial officers there. If your person could kindly get in touch with you and kindly hook up with me, I would love to be in touch with that person myself, or put that person in touch with the U.S. Embassy in Port Moresby. They are starving for this information. They champion it. They give seminars about it, and there's so little information on this surviving that the embassy is starving for that. So if there's any way that that person could get in touch with me through you, I suppose, it would be really amazing to keep her story, that person's story, alive.
Okay, well, Jaylene, you can email me. I'll put my email in the chat for everybody. It will take me a while to answer you. A few things are taking me out of the office in the coming weeks, but Jaylene, if you email me, ultimately I'll give you John's personal email address so you can get in touch with him. And that's the magic of a library program, right?
It's the magic of it, absolutely. And it's so motivating for me because I mentioned Biak Island, for example, a while ago, or Port Moresby, for example. Who's ever heard of Port Moresby? But at these presentations that I make, people do come out with their own stories, with their own ideas. They do, in fact, recognize these various enclaves, and they ask, how come nobody ever talks about it?
Yeah.
And it's so motivating for me to be out talking about it and sharing, our story. And so I can't wait to hear theirs as well.
That's great. Well, I've put my work email in the chat. So Jaylene, please note that and feel free to write to me and I'll put you in touch with John.
Fantastic.
One person is wondering, didn't you say that your father disappeared for a while?
I love it. Thank you for paying attention. Thank you for paying attention. After going through these 64 violent and deadly combat missions, he's not done with his service. Many of the soldiers and people thought that they were done after they served their time on the front lines. Many got rotated back to other theaters. My father got rotated back to the United States to fly medical emergency air transport missions. And in his case, the Battle of the Bulge had just ended. Field hospitals were overwhelmed in Europe, and they were trying to get the worst cases of these injured soldiers back to hospitals closer to their own native homes. My father flies nonstop for 2 months or 3 months, back and forth, crisscrossing the United States at a pace faster and more difficult than all of his combat missions, at an altitude, and this is the key point, at an altitude similar or greater than the altitude at which he was flying in New Guinea. None of the airplanes in which my father flew had supplemental oxygen or pressurized cabins. Flying as he did 5 times more frequently than he did in combat landed him in the hospital. He disappeared completely. We know that we can track my father's movements up until this point because he's in almost constant contact with my mother, his fiance at the time, writing her. There are no military records of his movements. There's no history of his movements at all. It's all documented in his correspondence to my mother. That correspondence ceases for 3 weeks. It ceases for 3 weeks. We know that nobody knew where he was. His own mother didn't even know where he was. He was lost and unaccounted for. Finally, 3 weeks later, correspondence emerges. My mother's name is Julia. He writes, "Julia, my dear, I can't tell you right now what came over me, but let's just say I've had my wings amputated." What we come to find is because he was grounded. He was no longer allowed to fly. What we've come to find out that flying in these unpressurized cabins at high altitude without supplemental oxygen, he was suffering from hypoxia. We can see that in the mood swings of his correspondence. And so, and I've had that information verified by the head of Harvard Medical. He took a look at some of the things that I showed him about my father's correspondence and about the oxygen deprivation. And so, in fact, kind of like an amateur kind of diagnosis, but the Harvard Medical verified it. He suffered from hypoxia, probably had an emotional outburst, and landed in the hospital without anybody knowing about it. And so that's how he went missing. He survives. He comes out of the hospital to get married and raise 6 kids, all of whom went to college. And so, you know, I do have a sister that believes my father suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. I do not share that. We grew up in the same household, and as you know, kids have different experiences of growing up and stuff like that. My sister and I disagree about my father's disposition at times, and you know, he was a normal dad and I was a normal bratty kid that got swatted around every once in a while for misbehaving. So I would never have characterized it as anything but him being a father. So yes, thanks for paying attention. He went missing, flying Battle of the Bulge, wounded, back to their hospitals closer to their native homes throughout the 48 United States at the time.
It's incredible how much stress he was under.
Amazing,
Yeah,
amazing. And again, we knew nothing about this. It's all got pieced together through his correspondence to my mother, which neither of them ever talked about while as we were growing up.
So one among us is wondering, did your dad keep in touch with any of the men that he flew with in New Guinea?
So yeah, I do have some of that correspondence as well that I got from them as I was researching the book. I was able to reach out to an Australian Foreign Service officer who had some correspondence with my father. One of my father's buddies corresponded with my mother over time after my father had passed away, and she saved some of that as well. And so, yeah, I do have some contact with them, and either through their old correspondence, and then just recently, one of my father's gunners found out about this. No, one of his nephews, the nephew of one of my father's gunners, excuse me, found out about my project and wrote to me, and I'm in touch with them. And then the daughter of one of my father's dear friends from the service contacted me as well about when she found out about the project. So it's amazing to be in contact with them, and you know, our relationship stems from, you know, the close association that our parents had together during the war. Just amazing stuff. Just amazing for me. Just amazing.
Another person is saying their dad was an airplane mechanic in New Guinea in the Philippines, and they have his letters. So you're really piquing people's interest. Another attendee is wondering, is there a copy of this on the internet? So well, thanks you for expanding their understanding of World War II.
A copy of the presentation on the internet, or a copy of the...
I'm not sure what they mean. Maybe they're talking about your book. I think that we can say that the book is available at the Newton Free Library.
Yep.
Navigation case. And if you go to the listing on the library's website, I'll also put a link in the chat if you want to reserve the book and read it.
Yeah. I do have a website if you'd be interested. I could tell you what that URL is.
Yes. Let me put that in the chat. What is it?
www.johnhappusa.com.
Hold on a second. .com or org or,
.com, johnhappusa.com.
okay, there you go. That's in the chat now.
Fantastic. Yeah, there's more information there. They can order the book through there. Yeah, and get all the information. Again, that mechanic in New Guinea, that information needs to be saved and documented, and same thing. I would put them in contact with the U.S. Embassy in New Guinea with this commercial officer, public service officer. He would love to know about these things.
I mean, I think it's quite incredible that there's people like you out there that have pieces of this history that would help, you know, the more bring the story to light through more public resources.
Yeah, that's amazing. Just fantastic.
Just before we close, I'm going to put a link to the borrowing the book from the library in the chat.
Very good.
Give me a sec, because it's hard to read questions and type in the chat.
Right. Good for you. Multitasking.
And spell everything right. Okay, so that link is in the chat if anyone's interested in contacting John and Jaylene. I already sent an email to you introducing you to John. So I think we are out of time. Everyone is really grateful for your presentation, John, and I just wonder if there's anything you'd like to say in closing.
No, just thanks for the opportunity. As you can see, this, you know, we represent, you know, the New Guinea campaign, and the Pacific War represents 15%. But it had been a forgotten 15% until we were able to get out and start to talk about these and give a little love and respect to the men and women that served in the Pacific theater. So it's really motivating for me, especially because of the feedback from the people, as you can see there. So thanks very much for the opportunity, Ellen. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much for your time, and to everybody for attending. And please do either borrow or purchase John's book.
Very good. You're very kind. Thanks very much.
Take care, everyone.
All right. Good night.
Good
Have a
night.
great evening. Thanks, Ellen. Bye-bye.
Bye.